Dr. Smith, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. It's a very unique opportunity to interview with you because you're not typically one of the kind of people that we hear a lot about in autism, but your background is super strong in the sciences, and one topic that seems to be really overlooked these days with mitochondrial dysfunction. So I want to get into that a little bit later, but first, why don't you give me a little introduction to yourself, some background?
Well, we began originally looking, probably 22 years ago, looking at the role of filterable forms of bacteria as the causative agents in malignancies. We didn't really get into autoimmune, neurodegenerative, and some of these other conditions until years later. We were strictly looking at the role of filterable forms of bacteria. When I say filterable forms, we're talking about pleomorphic variants that lack a cell wall. They have this unique ability to readily bind with cellular structures, particularly in the mitochondria. And they play a prominent role, certainly in malignant conditions, in impairing the electron transport chain and impairing the cell's ability to use oxygen to burn glucose and fatty acids. And so that's kind of where the work began.
Pleomorphic bacteria. We hear this term tossed around in and out. It's not a real common term, but yet it has some really big implications. Can you explain a little more what you mean by that?
When we say pleomorphic, we're generally talking about the capability of bacterial species to undergo significant morphological changes in their shape and size. The ability to shed a cell wall, the ability to move through various stages of development, where on one stage you may get a larger organism, and on another stage you may get an organism that's able to pass a 1-micron filter, very small, almost viral size. And because they're small, because they lack that cell wall, they're able to bind differently than some of the other bacterial species. But we're typically talking about just very elusive stealth pathogens, bacterial species that have the capability to bind with cellular structures and reap havoc.
Now, how do these particular pleomorphic bacteria, what are their implications in mitochondrial dysfunction particularly?
Well, typically with the work that we've done, which involves the extraction of the mitochondria and the analysis of the constituents, particularly the complex 1 protein, which we often hear about in autism, that's usually where we find them. We usually find them bound up with NADH, so they'll condense and they will bind with NADH, which is a transport intermediate. Remember, NADH shuttles the electrons across that membrane to produce energy. Without NADH, we don't get any real good pumping action and we don't get a lot of energy out of that system. So we would often say, for example, that cancer would be an NADH CoQ reductase deficiency. In other words, it's a dysfunction in the ability of NADH to move electrons across that membrane simply because it's bound up with these type of organisms. Sometimes it's not necessarily an organism. Sometimes it could be a carcinogen, a chemical structure like a benzene ring. Quite often we hear about that as a potential culprit in autism with complex 1 disorders. It could be a mercaptan, it could be an amine group. There are various other things that it could be, but in 90% of the cases where we've done extractions, at least with malignant cell lines, we found that it's a filterable form of bacteria. We refer to it as a stealth pathogen that's involved at the root cause of impairment.
So the implication is that there's a form of bacteria that is getting into the mitochondria and is disrupting the normal ability of the cell to produce energy. And what are those implications in autism?
Well, we see it. It's interesting in autism because we certainly have some research that indicates that autism is a mitochondrial dysfunction. We see that in granulocytes, for example, that play very important responses in the immune system, that they typically have a difficult time consuming oxygen. So we have an impairment in the oxygen consumption rate. Clearly a dysfunction in the cell's ability to properly utilize oxygen. We also see in autism that we typically have quite often lower levels of reactive oxygen species. Under normal conditions, cells produce a good, healthy amount of free radicals. That's a healthy response. Quite often in autoimmune disorders, we would say that we have moderate to high levels of reactive oxygen species being generated, producing an inflammatory response. We would generally refer to that as oxidative stress. But in autism, It's interesting because quite often we'll have lower levels of reactive oxygen species, and we have insufficiency in the amount of hydrogen peroxide that's being produced, for instance, in the cell.
So if a cell, from a very basic point, if a cell does not have enough oxygen, right, it's not able to generate, mitochondria is not able to generate enough oxygen consumption, what kind of results can happen?
Well, certainly you can get a dysfunction or a disruption to the production of ATP, the fundamental unit, energy currency of the cell. Certainly that's extremely important to consider in autism, because if we think about the systems that consume high amounts of ATP, we call those high energy systems. Examples would be the central nervous system, the gastrointestinal system, or the muscular system. All these systems are referred to as high energy systems. They require a large amount of ATP in order to properly perform. It's interesting, and coincidentally, those same systems are the systems that we primarily see as a problem and at the center of the discussion with ASD. And so we can certainly see the potential for mitochondrial dysfunction in autism, given the prevalence of problems in those particular systems.
So when essentially these cells don't have enough energy to perform their proper functions, we get a complete breakdown of systems, the central nervous system, the muscular system, from the very base level, from the cellular level. So if that happens, we can't detoxify, right? We can't, the brain can't operate functionally, and we get motor deficits, problems with our gait, different things like this. So this is a huge issue when it comes to autism, because we manifest in all these sort of issues. Dr. Smith, in autism, we are constantly searching for the root cause of this problem. Some of us have thought that it's mercury, possibly the vaccinations. It could be the electromagnetic fields. There's always a lot of talk about those can interfere with cellular communication. Talk to me about the root cause. What can really be at the root of these neurological conditions we're seeing today?
I think it's important to understand the difference between something that is causative in nature, something that actually can be identified and quantified at the level of impairment, and something that is correlative, or something that may be a variable that is leaning toward the symptom side of the equation. Quite often we hear people say that heavy metals cause autism. That's, in my opinion, not an accurate statement. We have to really understand that certain things can be predisposing factors. For example, somebody may be predisposed to a number of things that could cause hypoxia or impair the oxygen carrying capacity of the cell. Maybe they live in the inner city where the ambient O2 content is low, and over time we see hypoxia as a result of breathing in mercaptans all day long. But it's important to understand that hypoxia is a predisposing factor, and that the breathing in of toxic air is also a predisposing factor, but not causative. And when I say that, what I mean is that most of the causative agents that we've been able to identify across a broad spectrum of chronic pathologies usually involve either filterable forms of bacteria or a specific chemical structure that is actually bound up. Mostly we're looking at complex 1 proteins. So the difference between say vaccines causing, that's a very broad statement. If we say vaccines potentially cause autism, well, what in the vaccine causes autism? Is it potentially the filterable forms that we call mycoplasma that are readily associated with vaccines that lie at the root cause? Well, I'm not an autism expert, but I would suggest that we have seen research that suggests that the benzene ring could potentially play a causative role, and that some things like heavy metal or hypoxia or other predisposing factors may only represent a correlative variable in the equation. And that's important to differentiate between the two, because so many people are, the medical community at large, I think, is hyper-focused on symptomology. That's not a surprise, but a more disciplined focus on causation, I think, is what's missing.
Let's talk a little bit about a possible solution to the autism epidemic. You've been working on a program called the BX protocol, a remedy essentially that has a broad range of application for all kinds of neurotypical diseases. Tell us a little bit about this remedy.
And I think that it's important to understand that we haven't focused on autism, and yet we focused on complex 1 dysfunction. Complex 1 dysfunction, mostly in the form of NADH, CoQ reductase type deficiencies.
Mitochondrial dysfunction.
Mitochondrial dysfunction, where we have an impairment in the flow of electrons. So when we're looking at autism, certainly there's been widespread discussion about the potential of ASD in the context of complex 1 dysfunction, mitochondrial dysfunction, but particularly complex 1. We have 500 chemical processes in the mitochondria. We have many sites along the electron transport chain that certainly could be studied. Our focus has been on complex 1 because that's typically where we see the NADH get locked up and bound up with these organisms.
Is the complex 1, is it part of the initial Krebs cycle, the glycolysis cycle, or is it more later in the electron transport chain? These are three major phases of the mitochondria, right?
Right, and it lies at the beginning of the electron transport chain. It's that very first protein where the electrons from the food that we eat end up and ultimately, ideally, flow across that membrane to the production of ATP. But certainly it's interesting to note the similarity between proposed dysfunction with autism being a complex 1 disorder and the work that we've done in malignant conditions and in a variety of other conditions. Of course, to date, we've seen widespread success among a host of different chronic pathologies, not just cancer. But I think that with autism, we still, we've had a few cases and the results look very promising. We need to look deeper into it, and we need to have more cases in order to have some statistical relevance.
Tell me about the BX. What is it actually targeting? Is it an antibiotic? Is it an antifungal? Are you really trying to optimize a system? What's it going after?
The BX has very broad antimicrobial activity. We have very good results in vitro with various bacterial species. We have very good results with viral species. In fact, right now it's being studied in Sierra Leone against Ebola. It's been used with H1N1. It's been used with MERS in Saudi Arabia. So we have had very good results with EBV, for instance. So on the viral side, the specific mechanism involves the dehydrogenation of the sideband amino acids in viral species. On the bacterial side, the molecule targets the unsaturated proteins of the bacterial. So what we've done is we've found a common link, not necessarily something that's organism specific, so that we could have a much broader antimicrobial effect. In many of these conditions, we have many bacterial species involved in the same condition. Lyme disease would be a perfect example of that. Certainly, we do not understand the full microbial causation in autism, but I suspect that microbes lie at the root cause in many cases.
Yeah, very much so. So you're saying that you've found some similarities between bacteria and between viruses, and you've been able to create a remedy that sort of targets those microbes to basically break them down from a fundamental level.
Yes, what the BX is, quite often we'll hear people make fun of the BX that it's sugar water because we use fructose as a carrier. But certainly it's much more sophisticated than that, given the amount of money and the amount of time that we put into the development of the molecule. We've used fructose, we've used glucose, we've used malic acid, we've used lactic acid, all as carriers. We're talking about molecular structures that naturally flow down the metabolic pathway. That's the only reason we use fructose, is we're trying to exploit the metabolic pathway, both of the cell and also of the organism. These bugs eat fructose, they metabolize it. So what we're doing is we're essentially piggybacking an electrostatic charge onto the fructose structure in a way, and this is where the technology lies. We use, in some of the interviews that I've done, you'll notice a Varian nuclear reactor in the background. We take those reactors, we modify them for the purposes of charging the fructose structure and really embedding an electrostatic charge into the fructose that has an oscillatory match with the structures that we're trying to target. Again, the sideband amino acids in viruses or the unsaturated proteins in bacterial species. And it doesn't release that charge. The secret of it, the beauty of it, the novelty of the molecule is that it doesn't release the charge. The electrons don't migrate until it's at the site of impairment. And then we get a selective dehydrogenation of the organism. We are able to affect a bond cleavage, thus separating the organism from its vital role in bonding with NADH typically, and we're able to restore the flow of electrons. That's part of the process.
So it's not an herbal remedy. It's not, it doesn't sound like a homeopathic. Maybe it has got some similarities. It almost sounds like to me, sort of like static electricity. If I rub my feet on the carpet and then I build up a charge, right? I build up this charge, I can walk across the room and touch someone, and of course they're going to feel that. It's like I've become the carrier of a certain charge that I've built up. Is it similar to that?
It's similar, but it's very, very specific to the oscillatory rates of the organism's proteins. So essentially what we've done is we've worked with different organisms, we've extracted those proteins, and then we've been able to create a modeling algorithm that helps us understand what the oscillatory rate of the organism's hydrogen configuration is associated with that protein, and then we match the charge to the hydrogen. So it's kind of this, what we call matched electron migration is the term that we use, where we get a selective dehydrogenation. We're able to strip that hydrogen off, but it's really just kind of an interaction between an energy discharge on the molecule, where we get this burst of energy, the result of which is the hydrogen coming off. When the hydrogen comes off, the organism then is stimulated to uptake both free radicals and molecular oxygen. And from that point, we get some peroxide formation that then proceeds catalytically in the organism. It's like a domino effect where we light the organism on fire, and it slowly, and I mean slowly, it's like watching paint dry, will change to a non-pathogenic status and undergo destruction in the long term. But it's a very slow process.
So it's almost like from a analogy point of view, I'd have to rub my feet on a very special carpet that matched the frequency that I'm trying to actually attack or to disbond and break up, and then becomes the carrier.
Yeah, an appropriate analogy would be tuning forks that have similar harmonic resonance factors, where we're striking one tuning fork and generating a resonant response in the other. That would be a good way to look at it.
So we know that the BX actually has the ability to target various antimicrobial species, even some viruses, some bacteria, but also has the ability to aid in detoxification, certain chemicals and compounds like that. Can you give some examples of what you've seen?
And that's important to understand because there are toxins involved in a variety of pathologies as well. In malignancies, for instance, we will quite often see a toxin and not a microbe at the root cause in about 10% of the cases. Certainly in conditions like Lyme disease, we see neurotoxins. We've seen the role of mercaptans, the benzene ring, amine groups, other guanidine, methylguanidine derivatives, various toxic structures that can, in fact, impair the mitochondria as well. And we've had very good results. Same kind of mechanism where we get a dehydrogenation. We're targeting that hydrogen, breaking that hydrogen up, and we get actually faster results with something that's a toxin as compared to a microbe, because the dismantling of that structure happens chemically as opposed to along the lines of the physiology.
Can you give some examples of mercaptan? Where are people going to come in contact with this?
Yeah.
Is it like in Roundup? Is it in like household cleaners? Do you know anything where those sort of things are?
All the above. I mean, if we drive from here down to the store, we have hydrocarbons. We pass through the kitchen on the way out the door. We have chemical household products.
Benzenes. Where we're going to find these benzenes? Are they in?
We get them from chemical plants. We can see the benzene ring.
So if you live next to a factory or something like that?
Yeah, you go into any kind of factory, and if you're driving through an industrial section, you're getting all kinds of toxic exposure.
Yeah, interesting. I've been to your website several times. You have some really impressive cases there. The BX is not just for autism. Of course, it sounds like you really like to do some more testing in it. But you've had a great success in other neurotypical diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing with some of those conditions.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that one of the reasons we don't talk a lot about autism is because we have a very rigid standard for how we define success. We typically define success as the total and complete disappearance of a given condition without relapse. So if we're having success in malignancies, for instance, and you'll see on our website that we have cases that were on hospice care with a week and 2 weeks to live who 1, 2, 3 years later are completely cancer-free. So that is what we would define as success. With autism, we've seen a variety of cases do the protocol with good results, maybe 50, 60, 70% reduction in a lot of the symptoms associated with autism, and yet we don't necessarily say that we have success in autism. So it's really about understanding the standard and how stringent the standard is and what the goal is in terms of health restoration, complete and total health restoration. But we do have success in cardiovascular cases, even congestive heart failure, where we've seen complete remediation, Lyme disease, most of the autoimmune like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. We've had very good results in rheumatoid arthritis, in even juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, various malignancies, whether it's melanomas, carcinomas, sarcomas. So it's a very, very broad range. Parkinson's, other neurodegenerative conditions. We haven't had time to really get in and explore each of these because there's a lot of work to do when you're having success right now currently in 41 different pathologies. But we certainly need to get in and do some studies specifically with autism, and certainly that's on the list. One of the things that's interesting to consider is that in the mainstream we have this very popular phrase called the unknown etiology. Almost everything is an unknown etiology. They have plenty of drugs to provide you to address symptomology, but in terms of the underlying cause, who knows? When we're dealing with microbial activation, which in my estimation is the causative agent in most of the chronic pathologies, one organism or another, we have to understand the microbial landscape is very broad. It doesn't relate just to the mitochondria. We have the mitochondrial landscape, certainly that's the primary landscape, but we also have the intracellular landscape. We have the systemic landscape, what happens outside of the cell, and then we have a fourth quadrant that we typically like to consider, and that is the toxic landscape. Many of these organisms secrete neurotoxins, and that has to be addressed separately. The beauty of the BX is that it has enough broad activity to address all four quadrants of a microbial condition.
So a lot of parents, I'm sure, out there want to know that you're more than just a guy who's proposing a solution and trying to sell a remedy. Talk to me about some of the research that you guys have been working on.
Our original research focused on studying cell lines in vitro, where we're just looking at the effect of the BX on morphology, looking at the effect of the BX on cell cycles, particularly in malignant cell lines. It later grew into performing mitochondrial extractions, where we extract the mitochondria, examine the protein constituents. Then we moved into some clinical studies where we looked at the role of, we used what we call open respirometry. If you're familiar with athletic performance testing, this is something that you'd see a guy on a treadmill breathing in a mask. They're measuring O2, CO2, the exchange ratios, the volume of the gases. Very good qualitative clinical indication of how well somebody's cell is using oxygen to burn glucose and fatty acids to the production of ATP. We use that extensively clinically. We've studied exhaustively the role of open respirometry and exactly what types of things that we see there, and certainly we've been able to measure increased volumes, exchange ratios leveling out. In fact, we've done an extensive athletic performance study that lasted for about 6 months where we were working with professional athletes. In fact, there was an NBA team at one point that was looking at using the BX protocol as an athletic performance enhancement tool. We were seeing a 17 to 20% improvement in respiration. Now you got to consider these are people that aren't sick. These are professional athletes that really don't have a condition. So quite often when we talk about side effects, and that's a question that comes up, the response is, well, we have side effects, but they're positive side effects. So the use of open respirometry, the use of spectrophotometry, where we actually take the blood, we examine the level of hydroperoxides in the blood. This is what we would refer to as oxidative stress testing, but we can see the rise and fall of free radicals as it relates to the use of the BX in a clinical setting. We've done extensive studies there. Then we've later moved into PCR studies where we've employed the use of labs in various universities where we're looking at the impact of the BX specifically on the genes. We've studied 87 genes along the electron transport chain. We understand what type of impact it has with complex 1 or cytochrome C, and a lot of these things we haven't made available yet. We're kind of in the midst of still accumulating data and making that available on our website. Some of it's there. We've done everything from animal studies to clinical studies, not necessarily mainstream clinical trials, but mostly pre-post designed clinical outcome studies where we take the baseline numbers across the board. We don't really have to reinvent the wheel there. We extensively look at symptomology, and we look at the quantitative side of the blood work in any given condition, and we're able to, in most of the conditions that we work with, able to see outcomes, changes in both the lab work and in the qualitative side of the equation. With autism, we typically focus on assessing symptomology because symptomology is extremely important with autism. Certainly, with autism, I think it would be viable to have tests performed. We generally refer to them as mitochondrial function profiles, where we can specifically take a look into mitochondrial function, establish a solid baseline that we can then measure against. But for the most part in autism, we're really measuring changes in symptomology. And we typically will see 50 to 60% change across the board, across about 30 different symptoms in autism.
So you have the ability, if some parent said, you know what, I want to take my child to see Dr. Smith, you have the ability to possibly through blood work evaluate their mitochondria to find out on what sort of level that mitochondria is functioning?
Yes, we can take a look at, there's a test that's been developed out of Europe called a mitochondrial function profile. That would be a test that I would probably recommend as a baseline if somebody were wanting to quantify over and above the symptomology. If we were taking a look at NADH and taking a look at some of the chemical terrain within the mitochondrial landscape, within the electron transport chain, there is some testing that's available that could be quite useful.
So you could even do the preliminary pre and post testing before the BX, after the BX, and have an idea. Sure, you're going to be able to assess symptomology and improvements in that area, but you might also say, hey, we have 25, 30%, 40% more activity in the mitochondria now than we did before we started.
Absolutely, and clinically we can take a look at the role of the hydroperoxide, which is plays a prominent role in autism as it does in neurodegenerative conditions and autoimmune conditions. We would refer to that again as oxidative stress in autoimmune, but in autism we have lower levels of reactive oxygen species, particularly hydrogen peroxide. And through spectrophotometry, clinically, we can measure those baseline numbers and see the changes that then occur after they start the BH protocol.
Very nice, very nice. So let's say someone says, I really want to try this BX. Are they going to go to the local doctor to get it, or how does this work?
We currently have doctors in 18 of the 24 countries that we are in. Typically, 98% of our enrollments are directly doctor referred, but if somebody is coming from a non-referred source, then we have a process that we provide a free consultation. We take a look at the case, determine whether there's suitability, and then we can get them registered into our program, get them a sponsor, and potentially discuss an integration with a local practitioner where we can recommend some supportive protocols, or where the clinical work can be done and then fed into our system. Our program is primarily administered through what we call our online case management system, our back office. We've developed a very comprehensive tool that provides the member patient the ability to communicate with our staff. They're assigned one of our doctors who works with them for the entire year. They have the ability to communicate through internal email systems, attend chat rooms where we do case reviews one-on-one 4 times a week. We will tailor a custom report for that individual, both on the quantitative side of the blood work and the qualitative side related to symptomology. We can analyze data over 500 data points, so we'll look at everything from vitals to the symptomology, to the blood work, and then we do correlative analysis. We have the capability of exporting that data and running it through algorithms that we've developed. So it's a very sophisticated process statistically in order to establish a baseline and then measure changes as we move forward.
So they would get their blood tests and various tests done at home or with their local practitioner. Those get sent to you, and then your people monitor them from there on out during the program, correct?
Correct. So it's done primarily as a home-based program that's managed through our online case management system out of Cancun.
Now you've also got, in addition to the BX, you've got some really interesting therapies and devices and a health restoration center that you're working on?
Yes, as scientists, we get bored. Not to say that the energy catalyst is not a complex molecule. It's taken us a long time to figure that out. But there are 500 chemical processes in the mitochondria. There are more than one way to skin the cat, in a manner of speaking. So we've always been hot and heavy in pursuit of creating, developing different technologies that can impact mitochondrial function in one way or another. Depolarizing the mitochondrial membrane, promoting the leakage of cytochrome C in the mitochondria, all of which are certainly things that are hot topics. We've developed 8 medical technologies, most of which use either magnetic fields, pulsed radio frequency, stimulate photon absorption in the mitochondria, among other things. Very sophisticated technologies that are meant to support a clinical program. And we have a 110-acre facility in Jamaica that's in the rainforest. It's a beautiful, beautiful facility with waterfalls. It's been featured in National Geographic, and it goes all the way down to the beach. It's a beautiful, healing environment, but we've embedded our technologies into that environment to where they can come. They have a place they can come for a 30-day program, use those technologies, and have a expedited healing experience.
Very nice. This sounds really impressive. Dr. Smith, do you have any case studies with autism? Some patients that you could give us an example of?
We've had about 6 or 7 patients, members that have enrolled into the program over the past several years. The most recent of which is a lady who enrolled her daughter. I think it was her daughter. I'm asking the producer here because he actually is the one that did the interview. And it was quite an impressive case. It's interesting to note that out of the 7 cases, I believe at least half of them were doctors who enrolled their children into our program. That's kind of interesting. This most recent one is very interesting because of the extreme changes that we saw. And let me just go over some of these symptoms. And this is a symptom survey that we employ with autism. It covers 25 symptom categories, and we have some very specific baseline rankings. So we establish that baseline. The patient or the patient's advocate, along with their doctor, establishes the baseline number, and then we have them score that number on a daily basis for an entire year. And then we have a 1-year follow-up. At the end of year 2, we follow up. So this is after completing the program, and so I'm just going to read the numbers off the report. Abnormal responses to sensations such as light and sound from a 6 to a 0. Appearance of tuning out the world, 5 to a 0. Aggressive self-injurious behavior, 3 to a 0. Avoidance of eye contact, that was started at a 0. Extreme difficulty in learning language started at an 8.5 and went to a 3. So we didn't have resolution there, but we had very good improvement. Extreme hyperactivity or unusual passivity and extreme resistance to change from an 8 to a 0. Frequent crying and tantrums from an 8.5 to a 0. Impulsive behavior with no fear of danger from an 8 to a 0. Inappropriate responses to people, 6 to a 0. Inability or reduced ability to play cooperatively with other children or to make friends, went from a 6.5 to a 0. Inability to understand other people's feelings was at a 0. Insensitivity to pain or lack of response to cold or heat started at a 0, so no problems there. Need for a rigid, highly structured routine, being very distressed by changes in routines, went from a 6 to a 0. Peculiar speech patterns, 8 to a 3. Repetitive body movements, including pacing, hand flicking, twisting, spinning, rocking, and hitting from a 2 to a 0. Resist being picked up or cuddled from a 2 to a 0. An unusual attachment to inanimate objects such as toys, strings, etc. from a 3 to a 0.
I know it's really difficult to even get a consultation with you and with the Delta Institute, but you've been gracious enough to offer special accommodations for people from the Autism Summit.
We have to be very careful about consults because we have such a huge volume of people calling in that we usually put them through a conference call and a webcast before we even get them onto the schedule. In the case of Autism Summit, we'll let them bypass all of that, get directly onto the schedule where we'll invest considerable time. We put an hour, sometimes 2 hours into a case at no cost, but we do have to put them through a few hoops. In this case, as long as they mention that they're coming from Autism Summit, we'll go ahead and waive all of the preliminary requirements.
Now, if someone says, I think I really want to do this, tell us a little bit about the cost. How long is the program?
Our program is a very comprehensive program. It is medically supervised, so they're assigned one of our doctors for the entire year. It's medically supervised. Typical scenario would be they'd be in there doing the reporting on a daily basis. We'd be performing assessment daily and weekly for the entire year. During the second year, upon discharge, we put them on a maintenance protocol and we have them continue their protocol for another year. So essentially our program is a 2-year program, the first year being medically supervised. That's $17,000.
Okay, so that runs about $1,500 a month if someone were to kind of compute that on, and it looks like it's paid up front. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
They're purchasing a membership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, parents of autism are, unfortunately, the cost is something that we've sort of gotten used to and trying to figure out what we can budget to make these things work. Dr. Smith, I appreciate you taking the time to spend with me today, and I know the people in the autism community are really going to be interested in looking at this interview and investigating further into the Delta Institute. How do people find you? Where do you have a website? Can you tell us how they go there, what they can do to get a consult and whatnot?
They can visit bxprotocol.com, bxprotocol.com. They can submit a contact request as long as they mention Autism Summit, then it'll go into a different pile. Or they can call the 866 number off the site and we'd be glad to facilitate an appointment for them.